Welcome, everyone, to the 30-minute Midas touch from beautiful Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welsh WrestlePlex. Now, here is, pound for pound and inch for inch, the best of the best in professional wrestling today. A wrestling genius worth his weight in gold. The Golden Boy, Greg Anthony.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 30-minute Midas touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony. And with me, as always, is my co-host, none other than Malice, Mark Tipton.
Malice. Wow. Okay. Wow. I like that one. That's interesting. Well, you caught me off guard with that one. That doesn't necessarily go with where I was going with this in this show, but it is. I guess it could, but it. Anyway, you threw me a curve there.
Yeah.
On this edition of the 30-minute Midas Touch podcast, I want to discuss, and we want to discuss a subject that, well, let me come at it this way. In our society, a popular thing to do is troll people. Whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it may be, on social media, people like to troll. And an example of one of the things that people do to troll people is they say witty things. An example of such a thing is the phrase, size matters. And we're going to take that phrase and discuss it within the realm of professional wrestling. In professional wrestling, does size matter?
Absolutely. And and this is one of the things too, anyone that knows me personally, and for those of you who don't out there, I'm 5'8" on my best day. You know what I mean? I'm not a big guy. You understand? So I'm coming at it from an aspect of, yes, size does matter. The bigger, the better usually. The bigger guys draw more money. Because I myself went through kind of I wouldn't say an awakening, but I always wanted to be the main event guy, right? But I was 180 pounds. I was 170, 180 pounds. It wasn't till I put some weight on, and I was 210, 220, in that realm that the promoter started looking at me as maybe he could be a heavyweight because I was good enough. It wasn't a question of talent. I think it really was a question of size. So once I put on some weight and I got bigger, you know what I mean, then I was believable as a heavyweight and more believable against guys, even guys that were 250, 260 and 6'2". Because of my ability, I was able to transition and do that. And I think that's what professional wrestling we're talking about, because in professional wrestling, and it's something I've griped about on the show several times before is, we want heavyweight champions to be heavyweights. You know what I mean? I think that lends credibility to the business. If we go back to actual, if we have shoot weight classes, you know what I mean, then people will start to believe more in what we're doing. But now there's no actual weight classes. I don't even know if they call it a heavyweight title anymore in WWE. They just call it the championship. And because they know guys are 160, 170 pounds, Finn Balor size, wrestling for some of them. But I would much rather see a legitimate heavyweight.
All right. Yeah. Well, you brought that up, and I started running through my head. It is the Universal Champion and the WWE Champion. There's no reference really made to the weight class at all. I guess some other promotions still do, but the WWE, for example, does not. I guess I want to play into one part in there. You mentioned, and I think of it from a fan perspective, as always, excuse me. And I remember I was a great fan of Monday Nitro. I've mentioned my admiration for WCW. One of the things I always noticed is, at one point they went to 3 hours, and it was to get ahead of Monday Night Raw. And we know all the things that went along with that. And so I would always tune in to watch that. And I usually stayed with Nitro for the most part. But one of the things that I always noticed was the cruiserweights were almost exclusively featured during the first hour of the show. Now, would that, to a fan, would that be one of those signs that the promoters of WCW looked at the lower weight class guys as earlier in the show and wanted to save the main event for the Scott Halls of the world and the Kevin Nashes, etc.?
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good thought process. I mean, for us, especially when you're talking about cruiserweights, thing like obviously they have their place, and obviously they're immensely talented. It has nothing to do with talent whatsoever. We're talking about what can draw money and what's going to draw ratings and things like that. A lot of people have always used the excuse of or the line, well, Floyd Mayweather is the biggest boxing draw right now. Like, okay, but if there was a legitimate heavyweight, in the heavyweight division that was someone of markability at all, then Money Mayweather wouldn't be that. You understand? Like, if we had a Mike Tyson of this era, there's no way that Mayweather would be the top draw that he is. So he's a draw by default. You know what I mean? Like I said, there's guys that in the scheme of professional wrestling have transcended their size. Rey Mysterio obviously is the biggest thing. Every rule in professional wrestling has an exception. The exception to the size rule is Rey Mysterio. Because here's a guy who's 5'6", was 170, 180 pounds, but he was able to get over and make it believable, him wrestling guys much, much larger than he was. And it wasn't believable. I mean, it was believable and it wasn't phony. A lot of people, got behind it. So Rey Mysterio, like I said, is the exception to the rule.
All right. As a quick tie-in on the Money Mayweather, we could say that although he is not a large individual, he does have a big mouth. And he does put it to work liberally and use it to promote himself heavily and make himself that kind of attraction. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's what it's all about. It's all about, drawing the people and talking them into the building, as we said last week, I believe. So yeah, Money Mayweather is really good at running that mouth and creating that image of of what he is. But like I said, if there was someone equally as good to him in the heavyweight division, then we wouldn't be talking as much about him. You understand?
Well, certainly. Even Mike Tyson now did some kind of
and he
and it was a tremendous successful night.
Yeah.
Even at his advanced age, he's still a draw just because of the fascination with him and the power he is. And I do like what you said. We were talking about drawing money was the phrase I believe you used. Ultimately, that's what I hope the listeners and everyone understands. It is not that the smaller wrestlers aren't working as hard or not as committed as any of the heavyweights or anything else. Sometimes I have to remind myself that pro wrestling is a kind of a meeting of art and business in my mind.
Yeah.
I think that's why sports and entertainment and there's a clash. And it's not that in all honesty, when I would watch Monday Nitro, that cruiserweight, that was my favorite hour of the 3 hours. My favorite hour was the cruiserweight hour. And over time I did find myself sneaking over to Raw because I had seen what I considered to be the best part of Monday Nitro anyway. The in-ring performances, to me, of the cruiserweights far surpassed the perfunctory spray paint at the end of every episode of Monday Night.
Well, that's a good one. But also maybe you got to think of it too like this. Maybe you were drawn to the cruiserweights because that was the only place they were being featured, right? Because that was a huge issue too. Like that's what makes WCW so good. Yeah, the NWO, we talk about all that, but they capitalized on things that WWE wasn't capitalizing on. The fact that they had the cruiserweight division, all these guys from all across the world that had plied their trade for a decade, and all of a sudden they were all in the same place at the same time. We're talking about Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero and Chris Jericho and
Ultimo Dragon
and Juventud Guerrera, Rey Mysterio, I mean La Parka. I mean it just all those guys just like I said had traveled the world, and all of a sudden you put them on live television and they were doing something unique and different to the style that was used to in America. So it became this melting pot of lucha and British wrestling and Japanese wrestling and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, Ultimo Dragon, or as the Great American Dream would say, Ultimo Dragon. I always look forward to hearing him say that. He always did such a good job of getting behind those guys, and I appreciated it. And I guess You mentioned there about things WWE wouldn't do. One of the things I guess we ought to do with on this is that Vincent Kennedy McMahon has, oft criticized as you're going to be when you're head of the preeminent organization. One of the criticisms often leveled at him is that he has and I'll use the term, big man fetish.
I mean, that's a fair assumption. I mean, like I said, I remember in the early 2000s, the word around the campfire was, WWE had sent down word, hey, we're not hiring anyone under 6'2" barefoot, and then about a decade later, I'm at a strip club with Gerald Briscoe, and he confirms the same thing. He is asking me about guys, and he's like, "Yeah, are they at least 6'2" barefoot?" And I was like, "Yeah, they are." So it's one of those things that it actually exists, and I understand why it exists now. Back when I was younger, it bothered me too. Like, well, I could do that. I mean, why? I'm just as talented as them. But I had to realize it's not about that. It's about the visual and the overall. It's about our society in general, really. I mean, because we've had 100 years of these amazing heavyweights in wrestling and boxing and all that kind of stuff, bigger is always going to be better in most people's eyes. So, and we want people to come see professional wrestling, not necessarily that they're watching, their next door neighbor wrestle. There are obviously some people that, like we talked about, are the exceptions to that rule, like a Dusty Rhodes or a Mick Foley or someone like that. But for the most part, we want them to be a larger than life. Holy shit! Look at that guy. You know what I mean? Stone Cold Steve Austin. If you saw Stone Cold Steve Austin walking through Walmart, you go, he's somebody. The Rock, same way. I mean, and those guys are 6'2", 250, 6'2", 260, shit like that. So, I mean, like I said, there's lots of exceptions to the rules, but it doesn't change the rule. Bigger's better.
All right. I suppose if we could go through some examples. I guess we'll start with, to me, as soon as this subject came up, the first image that came to mind was the late, great Andre the Giant. If you look at someone like Andre, undoubtedly a draw. Still talked about to this day. He gets HBO documentaries made about him. He's, famous well after his passing. He's well known. And ultimately, what was unique about him was his size.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was legitimately a giant, and the folklore around Andre the Giant is one of the most amazing things. Of drinking 150 beers in a setting with Ric Flair. Flair said he saw it. You know what I mean? And the picture, I don't know if you've seen the picture of him holding the beer can.
Right. And it just disappears in his hand.
Disappears in his hand, which is mind blowing, right? So stuff like that. But also, Andre, yes, he was a draw, but he also was never in a territory very long. He was only in for like a week, or something like that. So because they knew that if you saw a giant once a year, that was special. But if he was there all the time, it lost its luster. So he was really the first international star, you know what I mean? Because he was the first one that Vince McMahon Sr. goes, okay, you can't spend 6 months in a territory. You can't spend 3 years in Memphis. You know what I mean? That'll kill you. So I'll book you a week here and I'll book you a week there. And he traveled he made a lot of great money and he popped all the houses when he went there. You know what I mean? So he was the first one that actually like, oh yeah, they could do it like that. That's a business model for Andre.
All right. Well, that's interesting. We talked about one of the things that I enjoy in as a fan is long-term feuds. So we talk about like Flair and Steamboat, Flair and Rhodes, those sorts of things. Austin and Rock, we mentioned those two guys earlier. They went back and forth over several years. And you referred to Andre, and what you described to me is kind of an attraction, almost like the circus comes to town. I don't want that to be viewed negatively, but it's something that comes through, but is not there every week. If the circus was in town every week, it wouldn't be nearly as big of a deal, right, so to speak. Do you think that someone with that size and we could even bring the Big Show into this conversation at this. Do you think that perhaps a detriment of being of that size is that when you try to do a long-term series of matches with someone, it kind of works against you, and
Yeah, it loses its value.
right,
And that's kind of been my thing with WWE too, is like with the Big Show, like you said. I mean, those same principles we were using for Andre, as far as, well, he doesn't need to be seen that much, only once a year for a week, in a certain territory, that kind of mindset should have been applied to how they booked the Big Show. You understand? Because if you see the Big Show every week on television, then it loses its luster, like we said, because you're seeing the Giant every week. You understand? But imagine if he would have wrestled for, let's say, a year. And then they gave him a year off. You know what I mean? Gave him a year off and let him maybe go to OVW or NXT or wherever it goes, and work house shows, maybe stuff like that, but kept him off television for a year. You know what I mean? And then he comes back. You know what I mean? Like, I think that would have been a much better way to use the Big Show over the course of his career, because what happens with when you WWE is a territory, no matter whether people want to admit it or not. It's just their territory is the entire world. Yeah,
the world.
the entire world. So, but the same principles of a territory still apply. So, in territories, there's very few guys that broke that 3-year max rule. You understand? Most guys had a run of 3 years. That was the initial run, right? But when you look at like Jerry Lawler in Memphis, Bill Dundee in Memphis, Vern Gagne in Minnesota, when you start playing on some of those things, the special, those guys were special to those territories because they were able to still be relevant past those 3 years. But it's very few and far between. Think of all the wrestlers that came through Memphis, right? And Lawler and Dundee were the only two that really were there start to finish.
Right. Well, you would have, I almost viewed them as guest stars. You would have, say, Austin Idol come in.
Right.
Jimmy Valiant would come in.
Right.
Tommy Wi-Fi Rich would come in and come out. But really, those two were the mainstays.
Yeah, and you can't have a territory full of guys that have been there for 10, 15 years. And that's what's the problem with WWE. You look at WWE now, and their roster in 2021 is almost the same as it was in 2011. You know what I mean? And they're pushing a lot of the same guys. You have to get those guys off TV. You have to get those people out of sight, out of mind. So when they do come back, it means something. So Dolph Ziggler and guys like that.
Okay, you just read my mind.
Yeah, I mean, they've beat that guy like a drum for 15 years. I mean, what else are you going to do with him? Okay, yeah, we all know he's really athletic and can sell and do all that kind of stuff. Let me rephrase that. He can bump. I'm not sure if selling would be the right thing. He bumps a lot more than he actually sells. But the thought process is, he's just been there too long, and people are tired of seeing it, I think, no matter how good his matches are.
Right. Not that he's not putting forth great effort, doing a great job. We appreciate it. It's just the nature of this is the entertainment business.
Right.
And, even great shows come to an end, barring the Simpsons or something like that. And now we're talking about cartoons. But I guess one of the things that came to mind as you were describing that in the business aspects of it, does that help explain why those larger athletes, say Andre, say Big Show, generally don't have championship runs? Particularly at the WWE level. Andre was in the WWE/F, I guess it was F his entire career, but he very rarely, except for, a short period of time, was he ever the WWF champion. And you would think he could, at any time, do so. Yeah. And the Big Show the same way. He was the champion on several occasions, but I don't remember any reign being particularly long or, does that play into it, why they wouldn't have the kind of main event championship success?
Yeah, and that all is indicative of whatever the booker's thought process is. You understand? I think WWE for them was in that Andre mold, like we talked about. They felt like that size of a guy was more an attraction than he was, going to be the main guy. You know what I mean? That and the simple fact that WWF is primarily a babyface company, or at least it was. You know what I mean? So I mean, you look at Bruno and Backlund and Hogan and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels babyface. It was always like John Cena. It was always like who's the big babyface on top, and we're going to throw him a bunch of monsters, that kind of thing, right? And he's got this hero has to overcome. I mean, which is great booking. You know what I mean? That's the way it should be. A lot of people, like obviously, like in the South, it's more heel based. It's more heel champion with the babyface chasing. You know what I mean? But either way works if you know what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that bleeds into something there. When I thought about this, as I was thinking about larger competitors and kind of things they face, I'll even bring in Kevin Nash here because I do recall he had a run as the WWF champion, but it is one of the most heavily criticized. I have heard him criticize his championship run heavily criticized. Obviously, he's 6'10". I believe he played basketball at the University of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously a large person, and he does have personality and all that. But even he did not have a great many championship runs, and the one he had was kind of criticized.
Yeah, and I think that was more of a timing issue than it was him. You know what I mean? If he would have been champion, let's say if Kevin Nash had been champion, like in 1990 versus Hogan, and he had won the title, and Hogan had to chase him to win it back. I think business would have been a lot better. But we're talking about 95. During that era when he was champion, it's like,
it wasn't a good time for business in general.
It wasn't a good time for business in general. All business was down across the board. So, I mean, I really don't think you can fault Kevin Nash. Like I said, he he had personality, and he was a big guy, and he had a look to him, and he could talk. I mean, he had a lot of the tools. Yes, he was not Frank Gotch by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, and this is why I tell my students too, we don't have to be able to do everything, but what you do, you must do well. And what Kevin Nash did, he did well. He did the sidewalk slam well. He did the squish in the corner well. He did the big boot well. You understand? He did the guy hit the ropes, and he'd give him the big forearm as they came to him. All that kind of stuff looked good, and he did it well.
Well, obviously, his size is very credible, and he did show himself he could be a draw as a part of the NWO. He was a focal point of it, along with Scott Hall and Hogan, obviously. And the NWO, we've discussed before, tremendously successful, made a lot of money, drew a lot of ratings. He was a key foundation part of it. But even then, it was really Hogan who was primarily the champion that represented at that time, and it really wasn't that.
And they were the tag champs,
right? And so he kind of found a place where he could go.
Yeah.
Well, this is a side note, but do you think one of the criticisms of the Big Show being a part of a weekly show is he kind of switched sides of the fence so often that it kind of lost.
Yeah, it just became comical. How many times is Big Show going to turn between now and SummerSlam or whatever it was? I mean, it was just, anytime you turn, it should be for a reason, but it should also be that story needs to be told after the fact. So, you need to have something in place for, hey, this guy's going to go on a year heel run or whatever it is. But, like, they would just, okay, let's turn you. Let's flip you back. Let's do this. Let's do that. Now, I know I've said before, like I hate the term tweener. Like, there's babyface and there's heel. The only time you're a tweener is like when you're in the middle of turning one way or the other, and it's only very briefly. That is not your ultimate role as a tweener. When people say Stone Cold Steve Austin was a tweener, no, you dumb fuck. Stone Cold Steve Austin was a babyface. He was one of the biggest babyfaces. He had a moral code, and yes, he may have cussed and did this. He was an anti-hero, but at the same time, he was a babyface, right? So, in that same vein, with guys like the Big Show and stuff like that, so you want them, especially like a big heel like that. When he's a big heel, he needs to just motor through people. Now I think the Big Show really could have been like I said, not a tweener, but he could have been what I call like an oh shit wrestler, which means like you could have a guy in the ring and go, well, guess what? Now you're going to go one-on-one with this guy. And then the Big Show comes out and you go, well, it's the Big Show. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, shit. You know what I mean? No matter if the guy's heel or babyface or what, you're like, hey, he's in for an ass whooping now. You know what I mean? Like imagine if you only saw Big Show once every 3 months and it was in that kind of role. You know what I mean? How awesome would that be? And then after that year, eventually he come back and has a legitimate like heel run where he's just beating the living fuck out of everybody, right? And then he wins the title. And then it's like, oh, shit, this guy's unbeatable. You know what I mean? Like we talked about with, you know, The Hobbit and Smaug the Dragon.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it looked insurmountable. It looked like there's no way they can defeat this dragon, right? So I mean, that's kind of the same thing. Like, how would you, if you build them up enough, it comes to the fact that people look at each other and go, I don't know how I can beat them. You know what I mean? How can they do it? You know, and that's what we want people to do. It's all about making people believe, whether it's for 10 seconds or 10 minutes or whatever the suspension of disbelief is. It's getting them in that mode to where, you know, they believe in what you're doing. So when, for instance, when we talk about bigger is better, that's what we're saying. We're lending credibility to the business itself because this is supposed to be a combat sport, right? Like Bill Watts, for instance. You know, a lot of people, you know, Bill Watts, you know, he's a huge champion of the African American community and race relations and things like that. And he was, but the reason that he put JYD on top, the reason he put Ron Simmons on top was because when you looked at other sports, African Americans were dominating every sport. So why wouldn't they dominate professional wrestling? So right. to him, it was a credibility standpoint of, hey, you know, we're just as credible as all these other sports. Look who are, you know, this is, you know, Ron Simmons is one of the greatest defensive football players in college history, and now he's our world champion.
Right. Well, and there you go, credibility. I would say that goes for JYD as well. Both two, you know, very impressive, believable, credible, however you want to say it, and having them at the top of the card would, you know, I wouldn't have batted an eye. Right. Let me see. Quickly, you mentioned the oh crap moment is the way I'll phrase it. I would be failing as a fan if I did not slip this in because when you said that, the name that came to my mind was The Undertaker. Obviously, a very large individual. He was in that 6'9", 6'10" area, well over 300 pounds. And I remember finally an era on SmackDown when he was often used in that role. Yeah. I remember the general manager, Teddy Long. Very often, you know, someone would do something and really get under Teddy Long's skin, and he would come out and announce that tonight you're going 1-on-1 with the Undertaker.
Right.
And Undertaker, if we're going to talk about size matters, one of the best. I'm going to say this, and I don't know that you'd argue, one of the best big men in professional wrestling history.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just one of the best big men in professional wrestling history, but one of the best gimmicks in history. You know what I mean? Like, there's no one else alive, dead, or otherwise that could have got The Undertaker over like he did. I truly believe that. And so, yeah, size. But here's a good example. I'm glad you brought this up. Would The Undertaker have had the successful run he had if he was 5'10"?
No. I have to sheepishly say no, he would not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's not, like I said, that's not a knock against people that are 5'10". I wish I was 5'10". But the fact of the matter is, it matters. You understand? And if The Undertaker would have walked in at 5'10" and people were supposed to be scared of him, you understand, it never would have worked. Like years ago, I was booking for a company here locally, and someone said, "Hey, I got this guy. He does a Michael Myers gimmick." Right? I was like, "Oh, it's cool, you know. Bring him down." Sure enough, the guy comes in. He's 5'6". You know, I'm like, "You can't." What? I was confused. I was like, "How do you actually think this is believable for you to come out?" It's almost comical. What do they put? You know, Michael Myers in the dryer and shrink him? You know what I mean? Like, it was just. The thought process was, and that's what I'm saying. The thought process in wrestling nowadays is, It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how athletic you are. It doesn't matter how, whatever it is. Like, everyone can do this. Come on, everybody, become a professional wrestler. It takes no psychology whatsoever, as Kenny Omega says.
I want to quickly move away from Kenny Omega after watching this week's AEW. In any event, what I would like to turn to is, very quickly, in the case of The Undertaker, you mentioned, because really you mentioned Michael Myers. He was presented to us as a literal monster. He was a zombie, essentially.
Right.
And
well, he was just, and let's get that. Even though they called him the Dead Man and stuff like that, I don't think it was a thing of, okay, he's an actual literal zombie. You understand? I think it was more of a thing of, well, this is a guy that obviously is into the dead and the occult and things like that, and that's a scary thing for, like me. I was 9 at the time. You know what I mean? So to me, that was kind of jaw dropping because I never seen anything like that before. So, what does he do? Does he worship Satan? Is he, does he, what is he trying to, I didn't know,
he has unearthly powers.
He has unearthly powers from. Is he using some kind of Ouija board for this? I didn't know.
Right. Well, we had the urn and Paul Bearer. Very quickly, if I could, I would like to just maybe in a little bit of balance here. I would like to mention smaller guys who made their size work for them and help make them successful. And you've already mentioned the 2 names that I had written down and I wanted to discuss here. The first one being Rey Mysterio, and the second being Superstar Bill Dundee. Those are 2 guys, neither of whom are going to, wow you with their physicality because they're both, smaller guys. But both of them kind of took that and kind of made it a part of their presentation, and it was part of their ultimate success, in my opinion. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And that's kind of thing too with myself. Like, I've tried, to be the Hulk Hogan type babyface or the the Superman-esque kind of thing, but like that doesn't work for me as a babyface. You understand? I have to be that underdog. Size matters. Getting my ass kicked by the bigger guy, like, because most everyone I wrestle is bigger than me in some way, shape, or fashion. Whether they're taller or bigger overall. But so that has to become part of who I am and what I've done.
All right, and really, those 2 guys, and I see we're getting close on time, but very quickly, I would just say, hey, those 2 guys had a built-in storyline for any kind of feud or whatever you put them with. It was the ultimate David and Goliath situation. Yeah. Because ultimately, whenever they come on one of those guys, the size, this old guy, I'll beat him easy and move up the ranks. And they became David versus Goliath. It was just a consistent story that the crowd, I can't tell you the number of times I watched Rey Mysterio wrestle Kane, and it was entirely credible, and I loved it every time. I watched it I don't know how many times.
Yeah, and that's the thing, too, with not only is it credible, but like it actually lends to how well those guys are able to do what they do. You understand? Like, not everyone can, and that's what we talk about. Rey Mysterio is the exception to the rule. You understand? So the fact that Rey Mysterio at 5'6", 7", maybe, whatever he was able to globally be a believable in the heavyweight division against Kane and Undertaker and Big Show and all these guys. It just lends to him and his ability.
All right. And would it be fair to say that because of what those guys did, they helped the guy they were working with be more successful and more popular with the audience, or if in the case of a heel, be more successful and get over with the crowd, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard Shawn Michaels say this before too. He said when it's that big guy versus that little guy like that, it's the easiest thing because the story's already told. Like, people see it. You understand? And that's what we're talking about. Like, visually, you see a guy that's 7 foot tall versus a guy that's 5'10". You're gonna go, I don't know about this. This guy's got an uphill battle no matter what, right? And the story's already told before you lock up or do anything. that story's already there, and that's already ingrained in people's minds with things like David versus Goliath and things like that. So here we are. We are never going to be exactly on 30 minutes. We're a little over this time. We're not as bad over as we were last week, I think. But for myself, the Golden Boy Greg Anthony, and for my co-host, Malice, Mark Tipton, which Malice was the Wall. Remember the Wall?
Oh.
So the big guy. See, you gotta.
I apologize. That one went past me.
Yeah. Malice, Mark Tipton. Thank you and goodbye.